What if everything the galaxy believed about humanity was completely wrong? What if the species they dismissed as weak, primitive mammals turn out to be the most terrifying predators the universe had ever seen? This is the story of how one simple mistake, one catastrophic misunderstanding, revealed the true nature of Earth's children and sent shockwaves through every corner of civilized space. The Galactic Council thought they knew death. They had cataloged the Vorthack war machines, witnessed the Zephyrian hive swarms, and trembled before the crystalline Nexery. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for the moment they realized they had been sharing the galaxy with something far more dangerous than any of them. Something that called itself human. The observation deck of the Galactic Council's primary station buzzed with nervous energy as ambassadors from dozens of species gathered to witness what many considered the greatest scientific achievement of the millennium. High Chancellor Vextar, his six-armed form draped in ceremonial robes, stood before the massive viewing portal that offered a panoramic view of the testing zone below. Distinguished colleagues, his voice echoed through the universal translators. Today we finally put to rest the age-old question that has plagued our scientific community for 3 centuries. Which species truly deserves the title of most dangerous predator in our galaxy? The crowd stirred with anticipation. Behind the reinforced viewing glass, a massive arena stretched for kilometers in every direction. The testing facility had been constructed specifically for this moment, a controlled environment where the galaxy's most feared predators could be studied, measured, and ranked according to their lethality. Ambassador Krina of the Zephyrian Collective clicked her mandibles in satisfaction. Her species had dominated the conversation for decades. The Zephyrians were insectoid nightmares, standing 3 meters tall with razor-sharp claws and the ability to coordinate attacks with hive-mind precision. Their reputation preceded them across every star system. Pirates avoided Zephyrian space entirely, and even a mighty Vorthack military showed them grudging respect. The results are predetermined, she chittered to her aide. Our species has conquered 47 worlds through pure predatory superiority. These tests are merely a formality. Across the observation deck, General Thrak of the Vorthack Empire disagreed silently. His people were living weapons, genetically enhanced warriors standing nearly 4 meters tall, with armor-plated skin and the ability to survive in the vacuum of space for limited periods. They had been bred for warfare over millennia, and their expansion across the galaxy had been relentless and brutal. The Nexery representative, a crystalline being whose thoughts moved through silicon pathways, pulsed with confident blue light. Their species could manipulate gravity itself, crushing enemies with focused gravitational fields. They considered themselves the apex of evolution, beings of pure energy housed in living crystal matrices. And then there are the others, the Krillian shock troops with their electric discharge capabilities, the shape-shifting Morphians who could adapt to any environment instantly, the Hegemony's bioengineered soldiers with their acidic blood and regenerative abilities. Each species present had earned their place through demonstrated lethality. All except one. Near the back of the observation deck, almost overlooked, stood Ambassador Sarah Chun. At barely 1.7 meters tall, she seemed fragile among the towering predators surrounding her. Her skin was soft, unmarked by natural armor or protective scales. She had no visible claws, no fangs, no apparent weapons of any kind. Her species had been included in the testing almost as an afterthought, a scientific curiosity rather than a serious contender. Humanity had only made contact with the Galactic Council 15 years earlier, when their primitive chemical rockets had finally achieved faster-than-light capability. The Council had been amused by these small mammals, with their crude technology and apparent lack of any natural predatory advantages. They had been classified as a developing species and granted observer status, but few took them seriously. The testing will proceed in phases, Chancellor Vextar announced. Each species will face identical scenarios designed to measure hunting efficiency combat effectiveness, survival instincts, and tactical adaptability. Our most advanced AI systems have created virtual environments that will challenge every aspect of predatory behavior. Sarah Chun listened quietly, her dark eyes taking in every detail. She had tried to explain to the council that humans might not be what they appeared, but her warnings had been politely dismissed. The other ambassadors saw her as a curiosity, a representative of a species so unremarkable that their inclusion in the testing was almost comical. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. The first phase began with individual hunting scenarios. Each species was presented with a virtual environment populated by various prey animals from across the galaxy. The goal was simple: demonstrate hunting prowess in the most efficient manner possible. The Zephyrian representative entered the simulation first. The crowd watched in fascination as the insectoid predator stalked through a dense forest environment, its compound eyes tracking multiple targets simultaneously. When it struck, the attack was lightning fast and brutal. Razor-sharp claws tore through virtual flesh, and the prey animal was dead within seconds. The crowd murmured approval. The Vorthak warrior followed, demonstrating the raw power of their species. Rather than stealth, they chose overwhelming force. The virtual environment shook as the 4-meter giant charged through the forest, crushing everything in its path. When it located prey, a single swipe of its massive clawed hand was enough to end the simulation. Efficiency through raw strength. Species after species demonstrated their hunting prowess. The Nexari representative used gravitational manipulation to crush prey from a distance. The Krillians used their electrical discharge to stun entire groups of animals simultaneously. Each display was more impressive than the last. Finally, it was humanity's turn. Sarah Chun had chosen to represent her species personally, despite concerns from the other ambassadors about her safety. The simulation environment materialized around her, the same dense forest that had challenged all the previous participants. The observers leaned forward, curious to see what the small human would do. Several species had already begun placing bets on how quickly she would be eliminated from the competition. The general consensus was that humans would provide an amusing interlude before the serious testing resumed. Sarah moved through the forest differently than the others. Where the previous predators had relied on their enhanced senses or natural advantages, she seemed to be thinking. She knelt to examine tracks, tested the wind direction with a wet finger, and studied the behavior patterns of various virtual animals. The other ambassadors grew restless. "What is she doing?" Ambassador Krina chittered impatiently. "This is a hunting exercise, not a nature study." But the more observant members of the crowd began to notice something unusual. Sarah wasn't just randomly searching for prey. She was learning. Every few minutes, she would make small adjustments to her approach based on new information she had gathered. She was adapting to the environment in real time. When she finally selected a target, the observers were surprised by her choice. Instead of going after the largest or most obvious prey animal, she had chosen a medium-sized herbivore that seemed to be part of a larger herd. But rather than attacking immediately, she began to study the herd's movement patterns. The human spent nearly an hour in observation before making her move. When she finally acted, it wasn't a direct assault like the others had employed. Instead, she had positioned herself at a narrow canyon passage that the herd would have to cross. She had learned their routine, predicted their path, and set up an ambush. The kill itself was almost anticlimactic. A single precisely thrown stone struck the target animal in exactly the right spot, causing instant death. But what impressed the observers more was the efficiency of the approach. While the other species had relied on their natural advantages, the human had used intelligence and patience to achieve the same result with minimal energy expenditure. "Interesting," murmured Dr. Zelthani, the council's chief xenobiologist. The human demonstrated problem-solving skills that exceeded expectations. But the real surprise came during the evaluation period. While the other species had completed their hunts and moved on, Sarah remained in the simulation. The observers watched in fascination as she began to systematically process her kill, using simple tools to create additional weapons and shelter materials from the carcass. Nothing was wasted. More importantly, she had somehow managed to use the scent of her successful hunt to attract additional prey animals. Within 2 hours, she had taken down 3 more targets without expending any additional energy. The other ambassadors watched in growing amazement as the human demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that none of them had anticipated. When the hunting phase concluded, the scores were closer than anyone had expected. While the physically superior species had achieved faster kill times, the human had demonstrated superior resource management and strategic planning. For the first time since the testing had begun, several ambassadors began to view humanity with something approaching respect. The second phase focused on combat scenarios. Each species would face off against standardized combat drones designed to test their fighting abilities under control conditions. The drones were programmed to adapt to each opponent's strengths and weaknesses, providing a fair assessment of combat effectiveness. Once again, the established predator species performed impressively. The Vorthak warrior tore through combat drones with brutal efficiency, its armored hide deflecting energy weapons while its massive claws reduced the mechanical opponents to scrap metal. The Zephyrian representative moved with insectoid grace, its multiple limbs striking from impossible angles while its compound eyes tracked multiple targets simultaneously. The Nexari demonstrated their gravitational manipulation abilities, crushing drones without physical contact. The Krillians used their electrical discharge to disable entire squadrons of opponents. Each species showcased the natural advantages that had made them feared throughout the galaxy. When Sarah Chun entered the combat simulation, the expectations were low. Humans had no natural armor, no enhanced strength, no energy weapons. How could a soft, small mammal compete against opponents that had been designed for warfare? The answer came in a form that none of the observers had expected. Sarah approached the combat scenario not as a test of strength, but as a puzzle to be solved. While the other species had relied on their natural advantages, she focused on learning the combat drones, programming patterns, and exploiting their weaknesses. The drones were sophisticated, but they followed predictable algorithms. Sarah spent the first several minutes of her test simply observing their behavior, dodging attacks, while she analyzed their movement patterns. The crowd grew restless again, interpreting her caution as fear. But then she began to fight back, and everything changed. Using improvised weapons and the environment itself as tools, Sarah began systematically dismantling the combat drones. She used their own programming against them, creating scenarios where they would damage each other while trying to target her. She exploited blind spots in their sensors, used reflective surfaces to confuse their targeting systems, and demonstrated a level of tactical creativity that left the observers speechless. Most impressively, she had somehow turned the combat scenario into a learning experience. Each drone she defeated taught her something new about their capabilities, and she used that knowledge to defeat subsequent opponents more efficiently. By the end of her test, she was moving through the combat zone with a confidence that bordered on supernatural. The final scores from the combat phase sent shockwaves through the observation deck. While the human had not achieved the fastest completion time, her efficiency ratings were through the roof. She had defeated every opponent while sustaining minimal damage and using the least amount of energy of any participant. Dr. Zelthani found himself reviewing the data multiple times, unable to believe the results. The small human had somehow outperformed species that had been specifically evolved for combat. It didn't make sense according to everything they knew about predatory hierarchy. As the testing moved into the third phase, survival scenarios, the other ambassadors began to pay serious attention to the human representative. What they had initially dismissed as a curiosity was beginning to look like something far more significant. Phase 3 transported each participant to a hostile environment and measured their ability to survive and thrive under extreme conditions. The scenario was brutal: a barren planet with extreme temperature variations, limited food sources, and numerous environmental hazards. The established predator species approached the survival test with their typical strategies. The Vorthak warrior relied on its natural armor and enhanced physiology to simply endure the harsh conditions. The Zephyrian used its hive mind connection to coordinate with virtual colonists for maximum efficiency. The Nexari manipulated local gravitational fields to create more favorable environmental conditions. Each species demonstrated impressive survival capabilities, adapting to the hostile environment through their natural advantages. But, once again, the human approach was completely different. Sarah Chun didn't try to overpower the hostile environment. Instead, she worked with it. Within hours of beginning the survival test, she had constructed a sophisticated shelter using only materials found in the immediate vicinity. The shelter wasn't just protection. It was a complete life support system that collected water, regulated temperature, and even began producing food through a hydroponic system she had improvised from available materials. But the most shocking aspect of her survival strategy wasn't the technology, it was the time frame. While other species were focused on short-term survival, the human had designed her systems for long-term sustainability. Her shelter could theoretically support life indefinitely, growing stronger and more efficient over time. The observers watched in amazement as Sarah began to systematically terraform the small area around her shelter. She diverted water sources, created soil management systems, and even began cultivating local plant life for food production. What had started as a survival exercise was becoming something that resembled early-stage planetary colonization. When the survival phase concluded, the implications were clear to everyone in the observation deck. Humanity hadn't just survived the hostile environment. They had begun to claim it. The other species had endured the test through their natural advantages, but the human had turned survival into expansion. Chancellor Vextar called for a recess as the xenobiology team scrambled to analyze the unprecedented results. The testing had revealed something that none of them had expected. Humanity might not be the weakest species in the competition. They might be something else entirely. During the break, Ambassador Sarah Chun found herself surrounded by curious representatives from other species. Questions came from every direction. How had humans developed such sophisticated tool use capabilities? What was the secret behind their strategic thinking abilities? How had such a seemingly weak species survived long enough to develop space travel? Sarah answered their questions patiently, but she could see the growing unease in their eyes. They were beginning to understand that they had fundamentally misunderstood what humanity represented. The small, soft mammals weren't weak prey animals that had accidentally achieved sentience. They were something far more dangerous, a species that had clawed its way to the top of their planet's food chain through pure intelligence and adaptability. As the final phase of testing approached, the atmosphere in the observation deck had completely changed. What had begun as an amusing display of human inadequacy had become something that made even the most confident predator species nervous. The fourth and final phase would test tactical adaptability and strategic thinking. Each species would face a complex military scenario requiring coordination, planning, and the ability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. It was considered the most challenging aspect of the testing, requiring not just individual prowess, but the kind of strategic thinking that separated true apex predators from mere hunters. The stage was set for humanity to either prove themselves as equals among the galaxy's most dangerous species, or to reveal that their earlier successes had been mere luck. But, as Sarah Chun prepared for the final test, the other ambassadors were beginning to suspect that luck had nothing to do with it. Something about the way she moved, the way she analyzed each situation, suggested that they had all made a terrible mistake in their initial assessment of humanity. And if they were wrong about human capabilities, what else might they have gotten wrong about these deceptively simple mammals from the small blue world called Earth? The tactical simulation chamber hummed to life as the final phase of testing began. Unlike the previous individual challenges, this scenario would test something far more complex: the ability to command and coordinate forces in a large-scale military engagement. Each species would be given control of identical fleets and armies, facing off against sophisticated AI opponents designed to challenge every aspect of strategic thinking. The scenario was brutal in its complexity. Multiple enemy factions, shifting alliances, limited resources, and constantly changing battlefield conditions would test not just tactical acumen, but the kind of deep strategic thinking that separated true apex predators from mere efficient killers. General Thrak of the Vorthak Empire stepped forward first, his massive frame casting shadows across the simulation controls. The Vorthak had built their reputation on military conquest, and their approach to warfare was as straightforward as it was effective: overwhelming force applied with mechanical precision. The observers watched as Thrak deployed his virtual forces in classic Vorthak formation. Heavy assault units formed the spearhead, while support elements provided covering fire from entrenched positions. It was textbook military doctrine, executed with the kind of brutal efficiency that had conquered dozens of worlds. The AI opponents adapted quickly, but Vorthak strategy had been refined over millennia of constant warfare. When the enemy attempted flanking maneuvers, Thrak responded with devastating counterattacks. When they tried to establish defensive positions, he broke them with concentrated artillery bombardment. The virtual battlefield became a showcase of Vorthak military dominance. But as the simulation progressed, subtle problems began to emerge. The AI opponents were learning faster than traditional enemies, adapting to Vorthak tactics in ways that real opponents never could. Resource management became critical as the engagement stretched longer than expected. Most importantly, the enemy began using tactics that fell outside traditional military doctrine, unconventional approaches that the Vorthak strategic philosophy struggled to counter. Thrak's forces achieved tactical victories, but found themselves gradually worn down by an opponent that refused to fight according to established rules of warfare. When the simulation concluded, his performance was impressive, but showed clear limitations when faced with truly adaptive opposition. Ambassador Kreena's turn revealed a completely different approach to warfare. The Zephyrian Collective operated on hive mind principles, with individual units functioning as extensions of a single coordinating intelligence. Their virtual forces moved with perfect synchronization, executing complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for traditional military units. The AI opponents found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move. Zephyrian units coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, sharing information instantaneously across the entire battlefield. When the enemy adapted to one tactic, the hive mind simply shifted to another approach without any lag in communication or coordination. But the hive mind approach had its own weaknesses. The Zephyrian strategy depended heavily on maintaining communication links between units. When the AI opponents began targeting command and control infrastructure, the perfect coordination started to break down. Individual units that lost contact with the collective became significantly less effective, struggling to adapt without constant guidance from the hive mind. The Nexari representative demonstrated the kind of warfare that could only be waged by a species with gravimetric manipulation abilities. Their virtual forces didn't just move across the battlefield, they reshaped it entirely. Gravity wells trapped enemy units, while gravitational lenses focused energy weapons into devastating attacks that could tear through any armor. The display was magnificent and terrifying. Enemy positions were simply crushed out of existence, their weapons and vehicles twisted into unrecognizable debris by focused gravitational fields. The AI opponents struggled to develop countermeasures against forces that operated outside normal physical laws. But gravimetric warfare required enormous energy expenditure, and the Nexari found themselves facing resource management challenges that their usual overwhelming technological advantage couldn't solve. As the simulation progressed, They were forced to use their abilities more selectively, rationing their most powerful attacks for critical moments. Species after species demonstrated their approaches to warfare, each showcasing the natural advantages that had made them feared throughout the galaxy. The Krillian shock troops used electrical warfare to disable enemy systems before moving in for close combat. The shape-shifting Morphians infiltrated enemy positions before launching devastating surprise attacks from within. Every approach was impressive, but they all shared common limitations. Each species relied heavily on their natural advantages, and when those advantages were countered or neutralized, they struggled to adapt. Their tactical thinking was sophisticated, but followed predictable patterns based on their evolutionary heritage. Then, it was humanity's turn. Sarah Chun approached the tactical simulation with the same methodical analysis she had shown in previous phases. But this time, the observers were paying close attention. They had learned not to underestimate the small human, and they watched with growing fascination as she studied the control systems and scenario parameters. What happened next challenged everything the galactic community thought they knew about warfare. Sarah's initial force deployment was unremarkable, a balanced mix of units arranged in standard defensive formations. The AI opponents began their assault using the same adaptive tactics that had challenged the previous participants. But instead of responding with overwhelming force or specialized abilities, Sarah did something unexpected. She began to lose. Not catastrophically, but systematically. Units were withdrawn from untenable positions. Resources were apparently mismanaged, and entire sectors of the battlefield were abandoned to enemy control. The observers exchanged confused glances. After the humans' impressive performances in previous phases, this seemed like a complete tactical collapse. Ambassador Krina clicked her mandibles in satisfaction. It appears the human has finally encountered a challenge beyond their capabilities. Their earlier successes must have been aberrations. But Dr. Zelthani was studying the tactical display more carefully, and what he saw made him increasingly uncomfortable. The humans' retreats weren't random. They followed specific patterns. Resources that appeared to be wasted were actually being redirected to particular positions. Most troubling, the AI opponents were being allowed to achieve certain victories that seemed almost convenient. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The human wasn't losing. She was learning. Every apparent failure was actually an experiment. Each withdrawal provided data about enemy capabilities and response patterns. Every wasted resource was actually being invested in intelligence gathering. Sarah Chun was treating the entire first phase of the engagement as a massive reconnaissance operation, using her own forces as expendable assets to gather information about her opponents. When she finally began her real offensive, the change was dramatic. Suddenly, human forces were appearing in exactly the right places at precisely the right times. Enemy units found themselves facing attacks that seemed to anticipate their every move. AI opponents that had adapted to every previous challenge found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by an enemy that understood them better than they understood themselves. But the most shocking aspect of the human strategy wasn't the intelligence gathering. It was how that intelligence was applied. Sarah wasn't just adapting to enemy tactics. She was manipulating them. Enemy units were being herded into specific positions, their adaptive responses guided by carefully orchestrated attacks that seemed random but served larger strategic purposes. The observers watched in growing amazement as the human forces executed a campaign that operated on multiple time scales simultaneously. Individual battles served tactical objectives, but those tactical victories combined to achieve strategic goals that weren't apparent until the larger pattern emerged. And those strategic achievements were themselves part of an even larger design that only became clear as the simulation neared its conclusion. The AI opponents found themselves in an impossible position. Every adaptation they made was anticipated and countered. Every strength they developed was turned into a weakness through tactical manipulation. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to understand the fundamental principles of warfare better than they understood themselves. When the tactical simulation concluded, Sarah Chun had achieved something unprecedented. Not only had she defeated AI opponents that had challenged every other species, but she had done so while suffering fewer casualties and using fewer resources than any previous participant. The efficiency ratings were so far beyond normal parameters that the simulation computers had to run diagnostic checks to ensure their calculations were correct. The observation deck was silent as the implications sank in. The small human had just demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that was orders of magnitude beyond what any of them had expected. This wasn't just superior tactics. It was a fundamentally different approach to warfare that operated on principles none of them had previously understood. Chancellor Vextar called for another recess as the xenobiology team struggled to analyze results that challenged their basic understanding of predatory hierarchy. How could a species with no apparent natural advantages demonstrate such overwhelming superiority in strategic thinking? During the break, the atmosphere among the ambassadors had become noticeably tense. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and more than one species representative was seen consulting privately with their military advisors. The comfortable assumptions about galactic power structure were beginning to crumble. Ambassador Sarah Chun found herself at the center of increasingly urgent questioning. Representatives who had barely acknowledged her existence a few hours earlier were now pressing her for details about human military doctrine, strategic philosophy, and technological capabilities. "How did your species develop such sophisticated tactical thinking?" demanded General Thrak, his massive frame looming over the small human. "What natural advantages enabled this level of strategic development?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "We don't have natural advantages in the way you might understand them. Humans survived on Earth because we learned to outthink our predators, not outfight them. We're not particularly strong or fast or tough. We're just persistent." Persistent. The Nexari representative pulsed with confused yellow light. "That hardly explains the strategic superiority we just witnessed." "Persistence in learning," Sarah clarified. "Humans don't give up when something doesn't work. We try again and again and again until we understand why it failed. Then we try something different. We've been doing it for millions of years." The implications of her words sent a chill through the assembled ambassadors. A species that treated failure as a learning opportunity, that adapted continuously, that never stopped trying to understand and overcome obstacles. Such a species would be virtually impossible to defeat in any prolonged conflict. Dr. Zelthani pulled up the complete testing data on his portable display, studying the results with growing unease. The human performance showed consistent patterns that were deeply troubling from a strategic perspective. In every phase of testing, humanity had demonstrated abilities that exceeded their apparent physical limitations through superior intelligence and adaptability. But it was the trajectory of improvement that was most concerning. The humans' performance hadn't just been excellent. It had been continuously improving throughout the testing process. Sarah Chun was literally getting better at each challenge while she was facing it, learning and adapting in real time at a rate that seemed almost impossible. As the recess concluded and the observers returned to their seats, the mood in the chamber had changed completely. What had begun as an entertaining display of predatory prowess had become something that felt distinctly like a threat assessment. The galaxy's most dangerous predator species were beginning to understand that they might have been sharing space with something far more dangerous than any of them had realized. The testing computers began calculating final scores and rankings based on all 4 phases of evaluation. The algorithms were designed to weight different factors according to their importance in determining overall predatory effectiveness. Hunting efficiency, combat capability, survival skills, and strategic thinking. As the calculations progressed, a clear pattern emerged. The physically superior species had dominated the individual categories that matched their natural advantages. The Vorthak had achieved the highest scores in direct combat. The Zephyrians had excelled in coordinated hunting scenarios. The Nexari had demonstrated the most advanced technological integration. But when all factors were considered together, when the testing computers calculated overall predatory effectiveness across all scenarios and conditions, one result stood out with startling clarity. Humanity had achieved the highest combined score of any species tested. The silence in the observation chamber was deafening as the results appeared on the main display. Numbers and graphs showed the breakdown of scoring across all categories, but the final ranking was unmistakable. The small, soft mammals from the primitive world called Earth had outperformed every established predator species in the galaxy. Ambassador Kreena's mandibles clicked in agitation. This must be an error in the calculations. No species without natural predatory advantages could achieve such results. But Dr. Zelthani was studying the scoring breakdown with fascination rather than disbelief. The calculations are correct. The human advantage isn't in any single category. It's in a combination of capabilities across all scenarios. They didn't achieve the best score in any individual test, but they consistently performed in the top tier for every phase. General Thrax's expression was grim as he studied the tactical analysis. Their strategic thinking scores are unprecedented. The simulation computers rated their adaptive capabilities as exceeding known parameters. The Nexari representative pulsed with deep red light, a color associated with concern among their species. If these results are accurate, we have significantly underestimated human potential. A species with such adaptive capabilities will be extremely difficult to predict or counter in any confrontational scenario. Chancellor Vextar stood before the assembly, his 6 arms spread in a gesture calling for attention. The testing has concluded, and the results are clear. However, I believe we must consider the implications of these findings very carefully. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the chamber. We have discovered that humanity possesses predatory capabilities that exceed our initial assessments. More concerning, they appear to have achieved these capabilities through intelligence and adaptability rather than physical advantages. This suggests a species that could potentially exceed even these demonstrated abilities given sufficient time and resources. The assembled ambassadors exchanged worried glances. A species that improved continuously, that learned from every encounter, that treated challenges as opportunities for growth. Such a species would only become more dangerous over time. Ambassador Sarah Chun listened to the growing concern around her with a mixture of amusement and worry. She had tried to warn them that humanity might not be what they appeared, but nobody had wanted to listen. Now they were discovering the truth, and she could see the fear beginning to creep into their eyes. The question that nobody wanted to ask was becoming obvious to everyone in the chamber. If humans were this dangerous when they were still considered a developing species with primitive technology, what would they become when they had access to advanced galactic science and technology? As the formal testing concluded and ambassadors began to file out of the observation chamber, the conversations were hushed and urgent. Military advisors were being consulted, strategic assessments were being requested, and more than one ambassador was placing urgent calls to their home governments. The galaxy had just discovered that they had been sharing space with something far more dangerous than any of them had realized. And now that humanity knew how they compared to other predator species, the question was no longer whether humans would become a dominant galactic power. The question was how quickly it would happen and whether anyone could stop it. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 3 days after the Predator testing concluded, but the damage had already begun. News of humanity's unprecedented performance had leaked through diplomatic channels, and the reactions across galactic civilization ranged from fascination to outright panic. Chancellor Vextar stood before a chamber filled with representatives from over 200 species, his expression grave as he reviewed the intelligence reports flooding in from across council space. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. The hegemony has placed a military embargo on all human space, he announced. The Krillian Confederation is demanding immediate restrictions on human access to advanced technology. And the Zephyrian Collective has formally requested that humanity be reclassified as a potential galactic threat. Ambassador Sarah Chun sat in the human delegation section, watching the proceedings with growing concern. In the 3 days since the testing, everything had changed. Trade agreements were being canceled, cultural exchange programs were suspended, and several species had begun quietly reinforcing their military positions along the borders of human space. The most troubling development was the formation of what the media was calling the Containment Coalition, an informal alliance of species dedicated to limiting human expansion and technological development. Led by the Vorthak Empire and supported by the Zephyrian Collective, the coalition was gaining members with alarming speed. Dr. Zelthani approached the central podium, carrying a data tablet filled with analysis that had kept xenobiologists working around the clock. His findings had shaken the scientific community to its core. "Colleagues," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber, "our post-testing analysis has revealed information that fundamentally changes our understanding of humanity and its place in galactic civilization." The chamber fell completely silent as he activated the holographic display system. Complex genetic charts and evolutionary trees appeared in the air above the assembled delegates, showing patterns that told a story none of them had expected. Human evolution followed a unique path that we have never encountered in any other sapient species. Most predatory species develop through specialization, enhanced strength, improved sensory capabilities, natural weapons, or advanced technologies. Humanity developed through what we can only call adaptive generalization. The display showed comparative evolutionary charts between humans and other galactic species. While most civilizations had followed predictable patterns of specialization, human development was characterized by increasingly sophisticated problem-solving abilities combined with an almost pathological persistence in the face of challenges. Earth's environment was uniquely hostile to human survival, Dr. Zelthani continued. The planet was dominated by faster, stronger, and more dangerous predators. Humans survived not by becoming superior predators, but by becoming superior thinkers. Every challenge they faced drove them to develop new technologies, new strategies, new approaches to survival. Ambassador Kreenaw's mandibles clicked in agitation. What does this mean for galactic security? Are you suggesting that humans will continue to become more dangerous over time? Dr. Zelthani's expression was grim. Our projections suggest that human adaptive capabilities operate on an exponential scale. Every challenge they encounter, every problem they face, drives them to develop solutions that exceed the original challenge. They don't just adapt, they over-adapt. The implications sent a wave of unease through the chamber. A species that responded to every challenge by exceeding it, that treated obstacles as opportunities for exponential growth. Such a species would be impossible to contain through conventional means. General Thrak stood from his position among the Vorthak delegation, his massive frame commanding attention. The military implications are clear. Any attempt to limit human expansion through force would only accelerate their technological development. They would adapt to counter our advantages, then exceed them. Worse, added the Nexri representative, pulsing with deep orange light, their adaptive capabilities appear to operate on both individual and collective levels. Each human learns continuously, and they share that knowledge across their entire species almost instantly through their communication networks. Ambassador Sarah Chun requested permission to address the chamber, and, after a moment's hesitation, Chancellor Vextar granted it. The human delegate stood, her small form dwarfed by the towering alien representatives around her, but her voice carried clearly through the universal translators. "I understand your concerns," she began, "but I think there's something important you're missing about human nature. Yes, we adapt quickly to challenges. Yes, we learn from every encounter. But We also form lasting alliances with those who treat us fairly. She gestured to the data displays still floating above the chamber. Every example you've shown focuses on humans responding to threats or obstacles. But our history is equally full of examples of humans forming cooperative relationships with those who extend friendship and partnership. The current situation is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, Sarah continued. By treating humanity as a threat, you're creating the exact conditions that would make us dangerous. We're being forced to consider military solutions to problems that could be solved through cooperation. Her words carried an implicit warning that wasn't lost on the assembled delegates. Human technological development had accelerated dramatically since first contact with galactic civilization. Access to advanced alien science had allowed humanity to make theoretical leaps that would have taken centuries to achieve independently. If the galactic community continued to treat humans as a threat, they might find themselves facing an enemy equipped with the best of galactic technology enhanced by human adaptive capabilities. The outcome of such a confrontation was becoming increasingly obvious to military analysts across Council space. Chancellor Vextar called for a recess to allow the various delegations to consult with their governments. The chamber emptied slowly, with representatives huddling in small groups to discuss the emerging crisis. But the most significant conversations were taking place in the secure communication booths lining the council chamber walls. The Vorthak Empire was mobilizing its military reserves, calling up entire fleets that hadn't been activated since the last major galactic war. The Zephyrian Collective was expanding intelligence operations in human space, attempting to gather data on human military capabilities and technological development. The Nexri were quietly withdrawing their most advanced technologies from joint research projects that included human participation. But not every species was joining the containment coalition. The Altarian Republic, a peaceful civilization of aquatic philosophers, had issued a statement supporting continued cooperation with humanity. The Centaurian Federation was actually increasing trade with human colonies, viewing the current crisis as an opportunity to establish preferential relationships with a rising power. Most significantly, the Andromedan Syndicate, the galaxy's premier trading consortium, had announced that they would continue treating humans as full partners in galactic commerce. Their statement carried special weight because the Syndicate's survival depended on accurately assessing the long-term potential of various species. In the human delegation's private conference room, Sarah Chun was receiving urgent communications from Earth. The human government was deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation, but was also taking steps to protect their interests. Admiral Torres wants authorization to begin full military preparations, reported Colonel Matthews, Sarah's military advisor. Intelligence suggests that several species are considering preemptive action to prevent human expansion. Sarah nodded grimly. What about the research initiatives? Are we still maintaining our cooperative programs with friendly species? Actually expanding them, Matthews replied. The Centaurians are sharing their industrial technologies, and the Andromedans are providing access to their commercial networks. It seems like the galaxy is dividing into two camps. The division was becoming more apparent as the emergency session resumed. Chancellor Vextar faced a chamber that was clearly split between those who viewed humanity as a threat to be contained and those who saw them as potential partners to be courted. The Vorthak delegation presented their proposal first: immediate restrictions on human access to military technologies, mandatory monitoring of human research facilities, and the establishment of a security buffer around human space that would prevent further expansion. The threat assessment is clear, declared General Thrak. Humanity possesses capabilities that could destabilize galactic civilization if left unchecked. We must act now to prevent a crisis that could affect every species in Council space. The proposal received immediate support from the Zephyrian Collective, the Krillian Confederation, and several smaller military powers. But it also generated fierce opposition from the trading species and civilian governments. Ambassador Yinth of the Centaurian Federation stood to address the chamber, her aquatic life support suit gleaming under the council lights. The Vorthack proposal is based on fear rather than rational analysis. Humanity has demonstrated no aggressive intent toward galactic civilization. Their only crime is being more adaptable than we expected. More adaptable than any species should be, interjected Ambassador Krina. The testing results show capabilities that exceed natural parameters. This isn't normal evolution. It's something unprecedented. The debate continued for hours, with each side presenting increasingly detailed arguments for their position. But the underlying dynamic was clear. The galaxy was dividing between those who wanted to contain human potential and those who wanted to benefit from it. As the formal debate progressed, Sarah Chun received a priority message from Earth that changed everything. The human government had been monitoring the situation closely, and they had reached a decision that would either defuse the crisis or escalate it beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. When Chancellor Vextar called for final statements before the vote on containment measures, Sarah requested permission to address the chamber one last time. The request was granted, and she stood to deliver a message that would reshape galactic politics. "Honorable delegates," she began, "I have received instructions from the Human Council that I am authorized to share with this assembly. Earth has been watching this debate with great interest, and we will make our position absolutely clear." The chamber fell silent as delegates realized they were about to hear humanity's official response to the containment proposals. If this council chooses to treat humanity as a threat, we will respond as any threatened species would. We will withdraw from cooperative programs, we will restrict access to human space, and we will prioritize our own security above all other considerations. The implicit threat was clear. Humans had already demonstrated adaptive capabilities that exceeded galactic norms. If they were forced to focus those capabilities on military development, the results would be unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. However, Sarah continued, if this council chooses to treat humanity as a partner, we are prepared to share our adaptive technologies with any species willing to engage in genuine cooperation. Human problem-solving capabilities could benefit everyone in this chamber, but only if we're working together rather than against each other. The offer was as shocking as the threat. Human adaptive technologies could revolutionize everything from industrial production to military strategy. Species that aligned with humanity might find themselves with access to capabilities that could transform their entire civilizations. The choice is yours, Sarah concluded. You could try to contain us and watch as we become exactly the kind of threat you're worried about, or you can work with us and benefit from our strengths. But you cannot have both cooperation and containment. The vote that followed would reshape the balance of power in galactic civilization. The containment proposals were defeated, but barely, and the margin of victory came from species that were clearly motivated more by opportunity than by principle. As the emergency session concluded, the galaxy found itself divided into three distinct camps. The Containment Coalition led by the Vorthack Empire, the Cooperation Alliance spearheaded by the Centaurian Federation, and a large group of undecided species watching to see which approach would prove more successful. But the most significant outcome of the session wasn't the political maneuvering. It was the realization that had dawned on every species present. The question wasn't whether humanity would become a major galactic power. That was already inevitable. The question was whether they would become humanity's allies or enemies when it happened. And based on the testing results that had started this crisis, being humanity's enemy was looking like an increasingly dangerous prospect. As delegates filed out of the chamber, many of them were already placing urgent calls to their home governments. The report, he commanded his intelligence chief, a scarred veteran named Commander Zextal. The humans have established formal alliance agreements with 17 species in the cooperation bloc, Zextal replied, his voice carrying the strain of delivering unwelcome news. Their technological development has accelerated beyond our most pessimistic projections. The holographic display showed the expansion of human influence across galactic space. What had once been a small cluster of primitive worlds was now the center of a rapidly growing alliance that included some of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Most concerning, Zextal continued, is the rate of innovation within the cooperation bloc. Human adaptive capabilities are being combined with alien technologies in ways we didn't anticipate. The Centaurians are reporting industrial productivity increases of over 300%. The Andromedans have developed new trading routes that bypass our economic blockade entirely. General Thrax's expression darkened. The Containment Coalition had attempted to isolate humanity through economic and military pressure, but the strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of limiting human development, they had accelerated it by forcing humans to focus on building stronger alliances and developing technologies that could overcome containment measures. What about our military advantages? Thrak asked. Surely human adaptability cannot overcome our fundamental superiority in firepower and numbers. Commander Zextal hesitated before answering. That's where the situation becomes truly concerning, General. Our intelligence suggests that human military technology has advanced at an unprecedented rate. They're not trying to match our capabilities. They're developing entirely new approaches to warfare. The display showed intelligence reports from the border zones between containment and cooperation territory. Human military vessels were appearing that operated on principles Vorthak military doctrine couldn't explain. Ships that seemed to adapt their capabilities in real time during combat. Weapons systems that learned from each engagement and became more effective against specific targets. Most troubling were reports of human advisor units embedded with cooperation alliance militaries. These small groups of humans weren't participating in combat directly, but their presence somehow multiplied the effectiveness of allied forces by enormous factors. How is that possible? Thrak demanded. Individual humans cannot have such dramatic effects on military performance. Our analysts believe they're applying the same adaptive learning principles that dominated the Predator testing, Zextal explained. Human advisors study enemy tactics in real time, then develop countermeasures that they immediately share with their allied forces. It's like fighting an opponent that gets smarter during every battle. The implications were staggering. The Containment Coalition possessed superior firepower and larger numbers, but they were facing an enemy that improved continuously. Every engagement, win or lose, made the Cooperation Alliance stronger and more difficult to defeat. Meanwhile, on Centaurian Prime, the Cooperation Alliance was experiencing the most dramatic period of growth and development in galactic history. Ambassador Yint floated in her aquatic council chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing technological and economic indicators that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The human integration protocols are exceeding all projections, reported Dr. Kethmar, her chief science advisor. Their adaptive learning capabilities are transforming our research methodologies across every field of study. The Cooperation Alliance had discovered something remarkable about human psychology. They were genuinely cooperative partners. When treated as allies rather than threats, humans shared their adaptive technologies freely and worked tirelessly to improve the capabilities of their partners. Show me the industrial production figures, Yinth requested. The display shifted to show manufacturing output across the Alliance. The numbers were staggering. Human problem-solving approaches, combined with alien technologies, had created industrial capabilities that were revolutionizing civilian life throughout the Cooperation Zone. Most remarkable, Dr. Kethmar continued, is their approach to knowledge sharing. Humans don't just learn from our technologies, they improve them, then teach us how to implement the improvements. Our entire civilization is becoming more capable at an exponential rate. But the most significant development was happening in the research facilities scattered across Alliance space. Human scientists were collaborating with alien researchers on projects that were pushing the boundaries of known science. Humans had somehow catalyzed a level of interspecies cooperation that had never been achieved before. In the undecided territories, species representatives watched the growing divide with increasing anxiety. The galaxy was splitting into two incompatible camps, and staying neutral was becoming increasingly difficult. Chancellor Vextar convened another emergency session of the Galactic Council, but this time the chamber was notably less crowded. Several species had formally withdrawn from council participation, claiming that the organization could no longer serve its purpose of maintaining galactic peace and cooperation. "The situation has deteriorated beyond our ability to manage," he announced to the reduced assembly. "The Containment Coalition and Cooperation Alliance are effectively separate galactic governments now. We are witnessing the beginning of the first true intergalactic war since the formation of the Council." The intelligence reports were grimmer than anyone had anticipated. Border skirmishes were becoming common, with both sides claiming the other was preparing for full-scale conflict. Trade between the two blocs had ceased entirely, and diplomatic communications had broken down completely. "Most concerning," the Chancellor continued, "is the rate of technological development on both sides. The Cooperation Alliance is advancing through human-assisted research, while the Containment Coalition is developing increasingly desperate countermeasures. We are seeing an arms race that could destabilize galactic civilization." Ambassador Sarah Chun stood to address the reduced council, representing not just humanity, but the entire Cooperation Alliance. Her position had evolved dramatically over the past months, from representing a minor species to serving as the de facto spokesperson for a major galactic power block. "I want to make one thing absolutely clear," she began, her voice carrying an authority that would have been impossible to imagine during the original Predator testing. "The Cooperation Alliance has no intention of launching aggressive action against anyone, but we will defend ourselves and our allies against any threats." The statement was carefully phrased, but the underlying message was unmistakable. The Cooperation Alliance had become militarily capable enough to pose a serious threat to the Containment Coalition, despite being significantly smaller in terms of total population and resources. "However," Sarah continued, "we remain committed to peaceful resolution of this crisis. Any species willing to engage in genuine cooperation will find us to be generous and supportive partners." Several undecided species representatives exchanged meaningful glances. The Cooperation Alliance was offering them the same benefits that had transformed their current allies, while the Containment Coalition was demanding military support for an increasingly desperate strategy. The vote that followed was even more decisive than the previous session. 3 more species formally joined the Cooperation Alliance, while 2 others declared neutrality and withdrew from the Council entirely. The Containment Coalition found itself increasingly isolated and outnumbered. As the session concluded, Chancellor Vextar made a private decision that would have profound consequences for galactic history. He requested a confidential meeting with Ambassador Sarah Chun to discuss options that had never been officially considered. The meeting took place in a neutral facility with only the most basic security protocols. Vextar had decided that the time for diplomatic formalities was over. "Ambassador Chun," he began, "I want to speak frankly about the situation we're facing. The Containment Coalition is becoming increasingly desperate, and desperate powers make unpredictable decisions. We need to find a solution before this crisis escalates into something catastrophic." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. "What are you proposing, Chancellor?" "Direct negotiations between the Alliance blocs, mediated by neutral species. The current trajectory leads to war, and a war between our 2 factions would devastate galactic civilization regardless of who wins." Sarah considered the proposal carefully. The Cooperation Alliance would be willing to participate in such negotiations, but only if the Containment Coalition acknowledges that humanity and our allies have a right to exist and develop without interference. "That may be difficult to achieve," Vextar admitted. The Containment Coalition is convinced that human capabilities represent an existential threat to galactic stability. And they may be right, Sarah replied with surprising honesty. Human adaptive capabilities are unprecedented, and we don't fully understand our own potential any more than they do. But trying to prevent us from developing those capabilities is guaranteed to create the exact threat they're worried about. The conversation continued for hours, with both participants trying to find a path through the crisis that wouldn't end in galactic war. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Fear and opportunity were driving the galaxy toward a confrontation that neither side really wanted, but both sides felt was inevitable. 3 days later, the first major military engagement of the new galactic war erupted in the Sigma Draconis system. A containment coalition fleet had attempted to establish a blockade around a cooperation alliance colony world, leading to a confrontation that would demonstrate the true extent of human military development. The battle lasted only 4 hours, but its results shocked military analysts throughout the galaxy. The Cooperation Alliance fleet, led by human strategic advisors, had not just defeated the containment forces. They had done so while suffering minimal casualties and capturing rather than destroying most of the enemy vessels. More significantly, the Cooperation fleet had somehow convinced nearly half of the containment forces to switch sides during the battle itself. Human negotiators had managed to conduct real-time diplomacy even in the middle of a military engagement, demonstrating psychological and communication capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. The captured containment personnel reported that they had been completely overwhelmed by the sophistication of human tactical thinking. The Cooperation Alliance hadn't just outfought them. They had understood the containment strategy better than the containment commanders did themselves. Word of the Sigma Draconis engagement spread throughout the galaxy within hours. Undecided species began joining the Cooperation Alliance in increasing numbers, while several members of the Containment Coalition quietly opened private diplomatic channels with human representatives. General Thrax studied the battle reports with growing despair. The Containment Coalition was fighting an enemy that seemed to improve with every encounter, while their own capabilities remained static. Worse, they were facing opponents who seemed genuinely committed to minimizing casualties and offering generous terms to defeated enemies. It was becoming obvious to military planners throughout the Containment Coalition that they were fighting a war they could not win through conventional means. Human adaptive capabilities, combined with the cooperative nature of their alliance, had created something unprecedented in galactic military history. The question was no longer whether the Cooperation Alliance would win the emerging galactic war. The question was how quickly it would end, and whether the Containment Coalition would surrender before they were forced to consider more extreme measures. As reports of additional defections reached Vorthak Prime, General Thrax faced a choice that would determine the future of galactic civilization. He could continue a war that was already lost, potentially escalating it to levels that would devastate everyone involved, or he could accept that humanity had become exactly what everyone had feared they would become, the dominant power in galactic civilization. The irony wasn't lost on him. By trying to prevent human dominance, the Containment Coalition had accelerated it beyond anything that would have occurred naturally. They had created the exact threat they had been trying to prevent, and now they had to live with the consequences. The galaxy was about to discover that human dominance wasn't necessarily the catastrophe they had feared, but it was definitely the end of the old order and the beginning of something completely new. The age of humanity had begun, not through conquest or intimidation, but through the simple demonstration that cooperation and adaptation were more powerful than any weapon ever devised. The deadliest species in the galaxy had turned out to be the one that made everyone else stronger.